Welcome to Season 2 of Policy RX with the Rock Doc. I'm Eric Murdoch, coming to you from the doctor's office in Estes Park, Colorado. On today's episode, we have Jason Keith, who's Access Fund's Senior Policy Advisor. Jason has been with Access Fund for a long time. He's an expert in natural resource policy, obviously with a specialty in climbing policy. Hey, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric.
I want to start off by just sort of thanking Jason for being a part of the Access Fund for so long. And some folks don't know about Jason. He's kind of behind the scenes sort of guy. And Jason, I was wondering if you could just tell us, like, how did you get involved in natural resource policy and law, and what's your background and how long you've been with the Access Fund?
I've been a mountain guide since the 80s and had been doing that for about 10, 12 years. And I realized that I had a real strong interest in public land conservation and outdoor recreation. And back in around 2000, I went back to law school, was practicing law in Colorado, practicing water law, realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. Job came up at the Access Fund. I was able to sort of marry my interest in outdoor recreation, climbing, and policy. And so I was policy director for a while before you came on board, Eric, and I've been senior policy advisor since about 2015 at the Access Fund, primarily working on national policy now, issues that we go to DC for a few times a year, but I also help on local access and conservation issues.
Yeah, you've been critical to the Access Fund's understanding of policy and how we set our positions and engage with the federal government as well as other governments. This episode is specifically going to focus on the recently issued draft climbing guidance from the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife, and U.S. Forest Service. We've had a lot of questions. We want to understand, how did we get here? What do these proposals mean? How do they affect individual climbing areas? What's the deal with these proposals in general? So let's get into it. This is a really important podcast for climbers and folks who are interested in public lands to listen to understand what these things mean, because this is a complicated issue and there are 4 different draft proposals and they're all different. So thanks for joining us, Jason. I just want to start off with this first question to help the audience understand, how did we get here? How did we get to where we are in 2026, where we're having 4 different draft proposals issued by the federal government? Obviously, this has been a long road. Can you sort of describe how the climbing community and our federal agencies got to this point?
Yeah, sure. So this has been many decades in the making, really. I mean, there goes all the way back to the 80s, really late 80s, early 90s, when there had been some proposed fixed anchor bans. And actually, the Forest Service and the Sawtooth National Forest had issued a ban that was about to become a national ban. And so we had been dealing with trying to manage fixed anchors, primarily in wilderness areas across the country, right at the same time that popularity of climbing was really increasing. So there was a lot more users out there. There was a lot more sort of pressure on the landscape, but no clarity really in the land management community about how to manage these things. What are fixed anchors? What are the reasonable limits for new routes? How should they be used? How should they be placed and maintained? And we went through many different local controversies or prohibitions or management challenges in various places around the country, which led to even just more confusion. So this had been an issue that had been going on, like I said, since at least the late 80s. And the land management community had still yet to come to any kind of consensus about how to manage these things. In the late 90s, the Forest Service conducted what's called a negotiated rulemaking, where a committee comes together and they try to come up with some consensus about how to manage these things. That negotiated rulemaking at the end of the day didn't really come up with a final policy, but it did come up with a framework that sort of serves as the basis for the underlying policy of where we are now, which is How do you deal with wilderness prohibitions, which prohibit the use of power drills because that's motorized equipment? How do you then manage the amount of climbing and how anchors are placed and maintained? And what that negotiated rulemaking basically came up with that got codified, so to speak, in some policies by the land management agencies basically says you can't have motorized drills in wilderness, and there should not be any bolt intensive climbs in wilderness, and that they should be rare. Now, all of those terms, except for the motorized piece, are really subjective and have been sort of the basis for a debate ever since. The Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service actually issued guidance in their various policy documents, whereas the Forest Service never actually got around to doing anything. And that's where most of the wilderness climbing is. So we continued through the aughts and 2010s. And even though we did get some national policy from the agencies, there was still a lot of difference in opinion amongst land managers at the local level. Some thought that we ought to allow new fixed anchors, some thought they were prohibited. Mostly, though, they were managed as necessary climbing tools and allowed in the places that we know the best, the Yosemites, right? The Wind River Mountains, those kind of places. But there was still a lot of inconsistency about how these anchors were to be managed and should they even be allowed at all. Fast forward to about 2022, and suddenly, right in the middle of the pandemic, even though we had been working just prior to the pandemic with the outdoor recreation community, land managers, many in the conservation community to try to come up with some workable policies, that collaborative effort stopped when the pandemic hit. We came out of the pandemic, and suddenly the National Park Service is proposing plans that would consider fixed anchors as prohibited installations in wilderness areas. That was primarily in Joshua Tree and Black Canyon, but these were really important plans that people were watching very closely and were going to set a precedent going forward. The problem with that is that this was going to lead to a prohibition of fixed anchors nationally, and the Access Fund sprung into action and began a campaign to push back against this new interpretation of the Wilderness Act that said these were prohibited installations.
Okay. So there was never a legal determination that fixed anchors were prohibited installations. We saw these local policies, these draft policies pop up in Joshua Tree and Black Canyon. And then Congress got involved and decided that it might be good to stem some of the waste in the federal government. Obviously, we've spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in the Forest Service, writing up plans that never got finalized and instruction manuals. And it's created conflict. It's created an unfortunate situation between some folks in the recreation and conservation communities that need to stay together. What did Congress do after that? After the proposals from the National Park Service?
Well, right. Those proposals came out that would have actually formalized the prohibition on fixed acres in wilderness. And some of these parks were actually inventorying routes and getting ready to remove routes that they thought were non-conforming. So the Access Fund worked with Congress. We actually got a letter from the Senate that had 14 senators, 7 Republican, 7 Democrats. So it was very bipartisan, that said, agencies, we think that you should consider climbing an appropriate use of wilderness, including the use, placement, and maintenance of fixed anchors, and that you could require prior authorization, but you should consider doing that not always on a case-by-case basis, but programmatically. So we got Congress to issue a letter right as the agencies had proposed these national prohibitions. And shortly after that, at the end of 2024, we got the Explore Act passed that included the PARC Act, Protecting America's Rock Climbing, that codified basically what had been in that letter from the Senate, which said, okay, agencies, go forth and issue guidance, but keep in about how to manage fixed anchors in wilderness. But keep in mind that Congress believes that that it's appropriate to climb in wilderness, including the use, maintenance, and placement of fixed anchors.
So another thing that the Park Act did was, in effect, grandfather in established routes because the proposal from the Forest Service and the Park Service actually included a retroactive analysis of all existing routes. That's tens of thousands of routes in 28 states across the country. Speak a little bit about that provision. There's not that much to the Park Act. It only does a couple things, and I think that's a really important thing that people need to understand as we lead into this public comment period.
Yeah, so these are what are called legacy routes, and all of the proposals by the agencies that just came out acknowledge that every route that was in existence when the Explore Act was signed is basically grandfathered in, unless there's some obvious conflict with wilderness character or natural cultural resources. So that's a big deal. That, as I mentioned a minute ago, some places were already inventorying routes to be removed. And so the fact that we were able to convince Congress to grandfather in existing routes was a big win for the climate community.
Yeah, it's always surprising to me that a couple places actually started implementing a proposal that was not yet finalized, but that's the
Right.
way it went down, and I think that's the real importance of the Park Act, and which is, as Jason mentioned, within the Explore Act. So, what happened to those policies? What happened to those proposals that were offering up that novel interpretation?
Well, after we got the letter out of the Senate and the Park Act passed, the Park Service and the Forest Service withdrew their policies and basically went back to the drawing board.
All right, so here's where we are now. So the agencies withdrew their proposals to prohibit fixed anchors. We have this law on the books. That's the law of the land. The law says that fixed anchors are appropriate in wilderness. The law says that routes established before President Biden signed the law on January 4th, 2025 should be allowed to be used and maintained, of course, making sure that they don't cause impacts to raptors and wilderness character and a variety of other things that climbers don't want to impact. And the law also stated that the agencies have to finally issue federal guidance within 18 months. We are literally at 17 months after it passed. Let's talk about the policies that the agencies followed through on it at the last, the 11th hour, 17 months. And now we're sitting on these policies. So what do these policies mean? Who put out these policies? Are they the same? Are they different? How do they differ?
There's four land management agencies that manage wilderness, and that's the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Those three are all in the Department of the Interior. And then we've got the Forest Service, which is actually the biggest player, and that's in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So, um, taking a step back here, as we're pointing out, these policies are actually a major positive for the climate community. This is a big course correction from the prohibition standard that was being proposed in 2023. So that's the biggest thing to remember. There's a lot of little fixes that we got to advocate for, and that's why we need climbers to weigh in. But this is a big win for the climate community and a huge change from where we were just a year and a half ago. The second major point is it's complicated. I just rattle off four different agencies. Each of those have their own proposals. Each of those have their own online portal that we need people to comment through. So Access Fund is going to try to make that as easy as we can for climbers, but just know that it's going to take some attention to detail in terms of where the advocacy voice is directed. So let's talk about some of the things that are common to all of these proposals from the three Interior Department agencies and the Forest Service, and that's the big thing, which is fixed anchors are no longer considered prohibited installations under the Wilderness Act, requiring a minimum requirements analysis. That's a big deal. Now, fixed anchors are also distinguished from fixed equipment, which could be considered things like, chains or slack lines or via ferratas or fixed ropes, that kind of thing. The other main thing that is similar in all of these proposals is that legacy routes, that is, those routes in existence as of January 4th, 2025, are grandfathered in. and they're appropriate. Now, if some of those routes are determined later to conflict with sensitive resources, including wilderness character, those could be managed and potentially removed. But the presumption is all of those routes are grandfathered in. So that's also a big deal. Also, you can replace unsafe anchors and you can place new fixed anchors. But how that's done via each of the agencies is a little bit different. So kind of the big picture is the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, is most flexible. They've got a standard that's called a casual use standard, which we can get into sort of the details of what that means a little bit later. The Park Service is the most permit heavy, right? They would require special use permit for the placement of new anchors or potentially what's called a programmatic authorization that can be done through a kind of a park plan, right? Where you don't have to go case by case. The Fish and Wildlife Service, most people don't really know Fish and Wildlife Service areas, but the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma is actually a really extensive climbing area, important to locals there. There's designated wilderness there. That's actually got some really good language. There's also some confusing pieces to that. And sort of maybe the middle ground between like the BLM and the Park Service is the Forest Service. That is really going to be driven by climbing management plans and how new anchors can be placed or existing anchors can be replaced will be driven by planning. But so far as it reads, it's not real permit heavy. It's going to be the Park Service that's going to be the most kind of potentially complicated in terms of how authorization is issued.
All right, thanks for that overview. And one thing that struck me, and all climbers need to understand this, is that the Fish and Wildlife Service, the BLM, and the National Park Service issued proposals that only reflect wilderness, whereas something's different with the Forest Service. Can you explain that?
Well, the Forest Service is also issuing a proposal that would deal with non-wilderness, which is really, really significant because most Forest Service climbing is not in wilderness areas. And there's a little bit of confusing language in how the Forest Service would consider existing areas. So basically, it's directing line officers to develop a plan if there are one or more climbing opportunities in their district or potentially in their forest, and how replacement anchors are dealt with under emergencies in all the agencies. If it's an emergency, there's an allowance there. They call it a different thing. But replacing unsafe anchors will take a bit of a process through the planning. And then developing new routes through new anchors will also be governed by climbing management plans. Now, how that's done is going to be complicated, and we'll be providing some really detailed talking points to the climbing community about where the exact questions are in all of these different policies, because there's little nuances and certain phrases the agencies use that can be a little bit confusing or have implications beyond kind of just the initial reading.
So the Forest Service scope is different than the three other agencies. And
Yep.
then also, which complicates things, is that it's my understanding, so correct me if I'm wrong, that the Forest Service is only offering up their policy for public comment for 30 days, whereas the Department
Yep.
of
Good point.
Interior agencies, the three other agencies, seem to be providing the public with 60 days of opportunity. Is that correct? And why
Yeah,
is
so
that?
the DOI agencies, climbers and others have until August 14 to comment, and with the Forest Service, it's July 20th, 30 days, as you said.
All right.
Um, and it's, it's kind of unclear the reasons why. Access Fund's probably going to request a comment extension from the Forest Service to make it 60 days.
So we've been getting a lot of feedback from the climbing community and friends in the conservation community. These are complicated proposals. There's several proposals. It's difficult to understand which areas they affect and how they affect different areas, how they affect your average climber. We know that a small percentage of the climbing community ever establishes new routes in the first place. We also know that wilderness climbing is really only it's less than 10% of the climbing in the United States, but of course it's some of the most important. For example, it's the entire, for the most part, the entire El Capitan, it's the Diamond, it's Linville Gorge, it's all of these important climbing areas. So this will have a huge impact on climbing in the United States and will likely set a precedent for other climbing management, including state, municipal, because these types of land managers at the local levels tend to look to the federal government for guidance, for hints on how they should manage climbing. So this has a huge impact. We've been getting a lot of questions, like I mentioned, and I just want to start rattling off questions from the climbing community, and we can start answering them and sorting it out. And I'm sure we're going to continue to do this for the next couple weeks. But I think the first question that's interesting is will these proposals increase the restrictions on wilderness climbing? And who's writing these proposals? Is this who in the federal government? Is this Congress? Is this Park Service people? Is it appointed people in the administration? Who's drafting this stuff? And is it going to result in more regulations on climbers?
Well, who's drafting it? The big picture is Congress issued a law that created the basic framework saying, okay, these are appropriate, go make some guidance, land managers. And so it's the land managers, mostly the career land managers with expertise in recreation management and wilderness that are drafting these policies for each of the agencies. Now, you asked initially, will there be restrictions? For most climbers, you won't notice anything. Hopefully, you won't notice anything because we'll be able to have some effective and practical ways to replace unsafe anchors. But for most people, you'll be able to just continue climbing as you have. It's not like we're creating any kind of new permit system just to go climbing. This is really mostly about the management of climbing anchors specifically. Now, the Forest Service, with their direction on climbing management planning, they may deal with all the other kind of ancillary things that are important to climbers, like approach trails and staging and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, there won't be any new restrictions on climbing activity. It will be just about how anchors are managed in terms of replacements and new placements.
So another question that a lot of folks in the climbing community are asking, and it's a tough question, is about sport climbing in wilderness or sport climbing on public lands. These particular proposals from the four agencies kind of refer to sport climbing in a couple different ways. They do use the term sport climbing. In one proposal mentions modern climbing. One of the proposals mentions bulk intensive climbing. How do these types of climbing fit within wilderness? Are they allowed in wilderness? And where are these important climbing areas valued and appropriate in the grand scheme of America's public lands?
Yeah, so sport climbing is not appropriate in designated wilderness. The place that we want to go sport climbing and enjoy those type of routes are in non-wilderness areas. That's part of what's being considered in these new proposals by the Forest Service is how they should manage non-Forest Service wilderness areas. And so climbers should comment on that. That is the place where sport climbing is appropriate. It's been a long-standing limiting principle for climbing in designated wilderness that bolt-intensive climbs are not appropriate. And that's what we think of as sport climbs. So climbers should know that as they're commenting on these policies, that we're not advocating for sport climbing in designated wilderness areas.
So how do we regard routes like on El Cap or on the Diamond or in Linville Gorge and many, many other places in designated wilderness that have a couple bolts, maybe a fixed pin, some fixed anchors to sort of supplement cam placements, nut placements, and any other types of removable protection?
Yeah, so we should be thinking about those types of climbing areas as focused more on removable protection. So traditional areas where fixed anchors are actually rare and only used as a last resort, and that we should be using cams, nuts, removable protection, and all those other landscapes that are designated wilderness.
Yeah, and the way I think about this is I think about this with respect to the entire spectrum of America's climbing and Access Fund values, front country bouldering in Central Park, New York, and we value wilderness climbing in Yosemite and everything in between. We think it's really important that climbers have this full spectrum of climbing opportunities. And the climbing areas in the wilderness are in some ways the most susceptible to impact. And it's important that we protect those experiences for the next generation so they can have more wild backcountry climbing experience. And if you want the front country climbing experience at Wild Iris or Ten Sleep or Smith Rock or many other places, of course, incredible sport climbing, Mount Lemon. We have a lot of non-wilderness where that's really a compatible activity. So, Jason, what are the behavior expectations for climbers in wilderness? So, we talked about the difference between wilderness climbing and not wilderness climbing. The policy drafts do not go into detail on what these behaviors expectations are actually. They talk about fixed anchors and they talk about how these authorization processes should be derived. They don't go into detail into exactly what it looks like to authorize a fixed anchor. But we could sort of deduce from these draft policies what the agencies think climbers should be doing in wilderness and how climbers should be acting in wilderness and what types of climbing should be done in wilderness. So can you kind of explain what the general tenets or principles are for wilderness climbing?
Yeah. So, first of all, it's up to us as climbers to know where we are and what the rules are in the particular jurisdictions where we're recreating. And, that's really easy nowadays. It's on everyone's phone. You can figure out if you're on Forest Service land, Park Service land, understand if you're in a wilderness area, and know what the different rules are for these different places. In wilderness, it's really important that we revere these places and act with humility and travel with a really light touch in these landscapes. It's really a privilege for us to be able to climb in these amazing places in Zion National Park and the North Cascades and Joshua Tree and all these incredible landscapes that are unique and are protected in perpetuity for their wilderness character. We're allowed to climb in these areas, and as Americans, we own them, but we also have a responsibility to protect them. And so, really acting with humility and leaving no trace is paramount.
Yeah, I totally agree with the way you framed that. And I think the folks in Yosemite actually wrote a really nice, what they're calling their credo, which sort of describes the restraint that climbers should have in wilderness and how it sort of adds to this incredible wilderness experience that provides so much to climbers. So I think, having climbing in wilderness is incredible and being able to experience the wilderness in the way it was intended is also incredible and makes us different types of people and changes us and I think makes us better people by experiencing wilderness on its own terms. So I think it's important for climbers to sort of assume that behavior expectation and manifest that behavior expectation when we're out in wilderness. There's a lot of other people that we share the wilderness with. And I think that we're lucky that, we're in this position right now with respect to the current drafts and the allowances, that the agencies are providing us. And now it's on climbers to act in a way that aligns with these behavior expectations. So we're getting a lot of questions from the climbing community about why is regulation needed, right? We know that a tiny percentage of climbers, far less than 1%, ever establish new routes, place fixed anchors. Why do we need this stuff? You talked about all of this, the history of this issue, but what's the deal? Does the
Yeah.
federal government need to be meddling in climbing management?
Well, I mean, I think a way to look at this is, I mean, climbing does have impacts, right? It's a growing activity. It's more popular than it's ever been. Another way to look at it is if we get regulation and we get climbing management and planning in place, it actually helps climbing because it reinforces the activity as appropriate and it creates kind of local sidebars on how land managers can, there were a lot of land managers that thought placing any anchor was prohibited. So, another way to look at this regulation, it's is a step in the right direction because we were coming from previous regulations that created a prohibition standard. So this new policy is actually needed because of the threat that was out there to climbing access and the ability to use climbing anchors.
I think one of the most exciting things about hopefully the final policies, and everyone should remember, we have these draft policies up for public comment. That does not mean that they are going to be finalized. That does not mean that the exact language in the drafts will be finalized. A lot of things can happen. That's why public comment is so important. But let's get into the weeds on some of these detailed questions. I think it's interesting. The term climbing management plan is thrown around in a lot of these policies. Some of the questions that we've been asked is, how does this proposal, these proposed drafts, affect areas that already have climbing management plans? As we know, very few climbing areas actually have climbing management plans. In the Forest Service, we have one in the South Platte, we have one in Mark Twain, handful in the Park Service, but really, compared to the amount of climbing, there are very few climbing management plans. But they do exist. And for example, we have one that's being developed at Bighorn National Forest, which will hopefully lift the development ban at Ten Sleep. But let's use that as an example. How would this new proposal, this new draft policy, impact areas like the Bighorn Mountains? It's got some wilderness, it's got some non-wilderness. It's got a climbing management plan in the works that's been developed. What are they going to do there?
Well, those plans don't go away immediately. So those plans will remain in place. And to the extent there's anything in these plans that conflicts with the guidance or the Park Act itself, that'll require an amendment to those plans. So climbers should consider each of those plans still the law of the land, but you should comment to the agencies about any inconsistencies that you might see in those existing plans and what the agency's proposing and what the Park Act requires.
So we're getting a lot of questions about the BLM proposal. The BLM proposal is kind of interesting. It's got some of its own
Yep.
interesting creative solutions. To start off on the BLM draft policy, how will the BLM draft policy affect areas that are non-wilderness places? We've asked questions about New Jack City or some other places that get a lot of use. They're
There's
not in wilderness. Is it going to affect my sport climbing habits in some of these places? The
it,
Homestead and other places.
it does not affect non-wilderness on
Okay.
BLM land. So that's places like that you rattled off and Bears Ears and places at Red Rocks outside of the wilderness boundary. So it
So that's
won't.
an interesting one to talk about. We had some questions about Red Rocks. Obviously, the sport climbing, for those of you who know, the sport climbing in the front country at Red Rocks is not in wilderness, so this wouldn't affect that. But in the back country, all the big multi-pitch routes, they are in wilderness. And the BLM introduced something that we have not seen before. And this concept of casual use and the idea that there's something different about newly established routes that have less than 5 fixed anchors, more than 5 fixed anchors. What's the deal with this BLM policy? How
Yeah, and
should
we
we be
still got
thinking
to
about
get
it?
clarity on that. But it's this concept of casual use that the BLM is proposing that climbers would not need a permit for what is considered casual use. And the standards that they've identified so far are 5 anchors or less and a buffer of 100 feet to the next climb. And that's what we think they're saying. So we need clarity on what that actually means. But so for the BLM, they are identifying what they think is a level of anchor use that is basically de minimis or not consequential.
Yeah, I think we need clarity on that. It's
Yeah.
it's not exactly clear if it means 100 feet to the next climb or another 100 feet to something else. But we'll keep analyzing that, and that's something that clearly needs some more clarity. Let's zoom out to all of the proposals. So, how does this affect me? I'm a recreational climber. I want to go to Yosemite, climb some of those big walls. How is this going to have an impact on me?
It's not going to have an impact on you, really. In fact, it's probably going to benefit you because we're going to have a pathway to actually replace unsafe anchors on places like El Cap. So, as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to need a permit now just to go climbing. What we're trying to do is ensure that the anchors that are in existence are safe. And so it should enhance your experience.
So let's go back to Bears Ears because we're getting a lot of questions about Bears Ears. Bears Ears, a national monument that includes Indian Creek, but has loads of other backcountry towers and climbing opportunities. It's an interesting place from a policy perspective because it's managed by both the BLM as well as the Forest Service. The Park Act grandfathers in existing routes. The BLM policy now and the Forest Service policy um, provide guides specifically for wilderness. How do you reconcile all these things? What's going to change, if anything, at Bears Ears? Are those routes grandfathered in? Is the park or is the new BLM policy and the Forest Service policy going to affect Bears Ears? How will this policy affect the forthcoming climbing management plan, which Bears Ears is supposed to develop?
Well, most people, when they think of Bears Ears, think of Indian Creek, and that is non-wilderness Bureau of Land Management land. So these proposals don't affect that, and it shouldn't affect that existing the climbing management provisions in the Bears Ears plan. Now, as you point out, there's still a lot of Forest Service land in the Bears Ears National Monument, and even Forest Service wilderness. But there's not nearly as much climbing there. I mean, Hammond Canyon, a few other places like that. But I think for how most people think about Bears Ears, this shouldn't affect it.
All right, here's a good question. Is this climbing management policy a red versus blue issue? Is this a partisan issue?
No. No, as I pointed out earlier when I was kind of sketching out the history a little bit, I mean, we got equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats on the letter from the Senate supporting this thing. The Park Act and the Explore Act more broadly passed unanimously in Congress. So this is definitely not a partisan political issue.
Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there. I encourage climbers to send a note to Access Fund if you have specific policy questions. Jason or I might very well answer your question and send you a note. We're trying to respond to as many people who ask questions as possible. We are developing our own comments. It's going to take a while because these are so detailed, but we're more than willing to help people with their own comments. And we also provided a really easy to use tool to submit comments to all the four agencies. It's pretty complicated. If you use our letter writing tool, you're asked to write a letter to the Park Service, BLM, and Fish and Wildlife Service, and then go to another site and submit comments to the Forest Service. But at least it's easier than trying to track down the individual portals for these agencies. And
Yep.
your letters, regardless of what your position is, will be submitted directly to those agencies. Thanks so much for giving us some clarity on these policies, Jason. Is there anything else you'd like to add when you kind of think about what we're getting into and what needs to happen over the next 60 days?
Yeah, I just really encourage climbers to weigh in. It really does matter. And I think I could sketch out here and just really briefly the main points that we're going to share this on our website and our various emails and everything. But the sort of the list of things that we really want to express to the agencies are number one, the guidance should be clear that the ordinary placement of unsafe anchors can happen without a case by case minimum requirements analysis process. New fixed anchors should not be subject to vague or inconsistent local approval systems unless there's like some site specific closure or conflict with a sensitive resource. Um, the agencies should distinguish between fixed anchors and fixed equipment. Legacy routes, that's a really big one. Legacy routes in existence before January 4th, 2025 need really strong protection for continued use and maintenance. And land managers should not be able to impose like these broad restrictions without some really clear evidence and a public process that they've gone through that benefits from local expertise.
Well, thanks so much for providing that simple overview of what these policies do. It's still pretty complicated, as we mentioned. So, talking to the Access Fund, talking to local climbing organizations is really important. But clearly, the most important thing is for climbers to weigh in on these policies, to celebrate the positive aspects,
Yeah.
and to respectfully critique the things that need to change. Access Fund will be writing and talking about this issue for the upcoming couple months during the public comment period. Remember that the Forest Service comment period, as it stands right now, is only 30 days, so please submit your comments there. Jason, thanks so much for joining us. I think it's going to be an annual thing. You're going to be the season opener for every season of Policy RX. This is a really handy feature that we have you, and we're able to sort of lean on you to provide us with some policy expertise. So thanks for joining us.
You're
And
welcome.
climbers, tune in for more. Send in your public comments, and be well. Take care, everyone.